Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I believe that all readers should read children's literature, especially adults. So that's what we do on the Kid Lit Love podcast. We celebrate all things children's literature picture books, early readers, middle grade, and young adult novels too. Whether you're an adult reading to your inner child or connecting the young readers in your lives with fantastic books, you've come to the right place. Each week, we'll talk to a different children's literature author and discuss their books, their hopes and dreams for readers, their writing process, and much, much more. So, grab a notebook to build your TBR and let's get to today's episode of Kid Lit Love. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Kid Lit Love podcast. I'm Stephanie, your host, welcoming you to another weekly conversation with a children's literature author. Today we're talking with John Schu, affectionately known as Mr. Schu online and in social media. John is one of the fiercest book advocates I've ever met. And by met, I mean followed online for a really long time until today. A former bookseller, children's librarian, Scholastic Book Ambassador, John shares book love wherever he goes. And now, recently, the man doing all of the reading and the sharing has become the one writing the books. Beautiful picture books like This is a Story, illustrated by Lauren Castillo. This is a School, illustrated by Veronica Mills Jameson. The one adult nonfiction book that has the most sticky notes inside of it, because I cannot stop thinking about it, The Gift of Story. And the book we're going to talk about today on the podcast, his new middle grade novel in verse, Louder Than Hunger. John, welcome to the Kid Lit Love podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Oh, I'm so grateful to be here. And that was the most beautiful introduction. I was touching my heart the entire time, which listeners could not see. So thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. I don't know how many years it's been since I first clicked follow, likely on Twitter, but it's been a very long time. And I am just so thrilled to be able to talk with you because you truly have brought so much book love and book joy and book everything into my life, which means I can then share it with my teachers and their students. And then that wonderful book, cycle just goes on and on and on. So why don't we start at the beginning? And for those that are new to your work, I'd love you to give a little bit of the backstory on the how and the why books and reading and words are just so important and brought you to today, which is from reading a lot of them and sharing them to actually writing them.
I love that question, and I love going back in time. So we're going to go back in time to the year 1999. In the year 1999, I enrolled at Illinois State University in Normal, Illinois, as an elementary school major. And I always knew I wanted to be an elementary school teacher. And I would tell anybody who would listen to me that I was going to be the world's best third grade teacher, which put a lot of pressure on myself. But I did become a third grade teacher, and I loved being a third grade teacher. And the thing that I loved the most about being a third grade teacher was the read aloud. And I think I became a better teacher and a better human because of reading aloud books with students. And I always say, we're not just reading the book together, we're experiencing the book together. And then, as I always tell kids, I was promoted and I became a fourth grade teacher. I did not want to become a fourth grade teacher, but because of enrollment, it was my turn to move grades. And I looped with my students, and it was so magical because I knew all of them right away on the first day of school. And then I went to library school to learn how to be a librarian. And a lot of the reason I went to library school was because of the read aloud, because I loved sharing my heart through stories, and I loved book talking books, and of course, as I already said, reading aloud. So I became a school librarian, and I did that for 9 years, and I loved every single day of it. And then I left to become the ambassador of school libraries, where I traveled all over the country advocating for school librarians and school libraries, and reminding people that every child deserves to go to a school with a full-time school librarian, that going to a school with a full-time school librarian should never be seen as a privilege, but as a right. And it was doing that work of traveling from state to state, from conference to conference, that I told myself that I was ready to start writing my own stories and start having my stories be part of the conversation. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's what
Yes.
your question inspired me to say.
Yes. No, you did answer it. You went back to the beginning, where it all started, how that love kind of snowballed, and then I love how that led you to telling your own story through the books. And I know we're here today to talk about Louder Than Hunger, but I can't help but sneak in a little bit of admiration and love for your two picture
Oh, thank
books.
you. Thank you.
From one reader to another, someone who loves books and reading, to another, someone who loves books and reading, and to two educators. Both books have a really special place on my bookshelf. My bookshelf is very packed, as I imagine yours is too. You've got the first row of books, and then you have the books that are piled on top of those books as you're trying to fit. But those picture books are actually turned out
Oh,
because
oh,
I,
thank
I
you.
love to see them. So
Well, I loved actually whenever I'm writing, they're always in front of me. Like those two picture books. This is a school and this is a story. And it's to remind myself, I've done it before. I've written a book before. And I love that the little girl on the cover of This Is a Story, Lauren Castillo named her Greta. She always inspires me. I love the way that she's throwing back her head and her eyes are closed and she's maybe taking in the new book smell and she's
yeah.
just like her heart is becoming bigger. And I know she's was created because of my manuscript, but it's all Lauren Castillo, and that little girl inspires me so much.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when you read it, if you're a reader, you can feel that. You have that instant kinship with the
Thank
pages
you.
in those books. So I just love those picture books. And as I mentioned, your nonfiction adult book, The Gift of Story, probably has, and no one else can see it, but you
Oh, I love seeing the sticky notes. That makes me
more
so
color.
happy.
Yeah, they are everywhere because it's when I read this book and I had followed you for a while. I knew that we shared book love, and all of the things about reading and books and education. But when I read the book and I sticky noted it everywhere, books have been such an integral part of who I am and who I've become right from the get-go, from the first time, I read The Monster at the end of this book, all
Oh.
the way to, the more books as I grow through. It's like, you meet a friend and you think, he gets it. He gets,
Oh.
he gets what books have done and what books can do. And so I love this book for so many reasons because I feel like you get me and you get readers
Oh, that is so
everywhere.
beautiful. Compliments are so hard for me that I'm trying just to accept it. I'm accepting it.
Right,
Thank,
right.
thank you. No, and writing that book was so hard, and I'm so grateful that I accomplished it. Like right now, we're doing this interview I'm in the Marriott Marquis in New York, and that entire book was revised in the hotel where we're speaking right
Oh, wow.
now. And whenever I arrive, they always say, "Welcome home." They call me the writer because all of my books are written in the Marriott Marquis, and that one especially, like I can feel that book, which may sound strange when I'm in this hotel because I wandered around this hotel thinking about the things that are now in that book.
Yeah.
Yeah. And some
I
people
love
say it's like a John Schu hug, which I think is the best review. I
yes.
know I'm John Schu, but
That is it. That is it exactly. It's a John Schu hug, and you can feel it through the book love, but also through the words, but the book covers, the sheer
oh,
amount of children's literature that's recommended. And I love, the authors themselves are there sharing their ideas, and you can't help but close the book and just want to spend
oh.
the next couple of hours, ignoring everything going on in your home to
Uh-huh.
just read.
I
So
love that. And I love that there's so many different ways to read the book. That's not me, that was the designer. That some people I've heard read all the story is. Their story is, I asked over 500 people to finish the sentence starter. Story is dot, dot, dot. And then we group them into categories. And I love you could just read those. A lot of people go back to those. You could just read the guest contributors. You could just read the book recommendations, or you can read it in order. But I've met very few people who actually read it in order. They each have their own unique way of reading it, which I really love.
Okay, well, you can put me down as someone who read it in order first
Oh,
and then went back
went
and
back.
reread all of those sections that I love. I am a rule follower.
Oh, so you're not somebody that reads the ending of the book at the
Oh,
beginning.
no,
I
no,
just can't
no.
imagine doing that. I'm meeting more and more people who do that. I've met so many children recently that say they read the end.
Wow,
I
they
could
can't.
not do that. No judgment, though.
No, no, not at all. We all have our own little reading quirks that can work for us. So the book that we're talking about today, though, Louder Than Hunger, it's different, right? You've got
Very.
two picture books that are beautiful books based on stories and school and celebrating the love of reading. And while that thread is definitely in this book, both reading and writing and creating, it definitely has a different focus. And so I'd love for you to introduce Louder Than Hunger to listeners.
Oh, thank you. I love talking about Louder Than Hunger. Let's see, I'm going to do this version. I have like 10 different versions. So we're going to do this one. So
Okay.
Louder Than Hunger takes place in the year 1996. So it's historical fiction, I guess. And it opens with you not you knowing that it's 1996 because Jake writes that in his journal. So you learn right away that Jake loves roller skating. You learn that his favorite movie is Home Alone. He loves Lois Lowry's The Giver. And there's one spot, though, in the opening where you know it's the notebook that says favorite food. And Jake leaves that blank. And the reason Jake leaves that blank is because in Act One, I see the book as 4 acts. In Act One, you meet Jake Stacy when he's spiraling out of control. And there's a voice inside of his head, an inner saboteur, that tells him that he's worthless, that he's miserable, that he doesn't deserve food, and really that he doesn't deserve to live. And the voice is so loud in the first act that Jake is just doing everything that the voice tells him. Every day, Jake Stacy, and I'm going to back up just a little bit and share something, which is his name is Jake Edward Stacy, and my name is John Edward Schumacher. That's my legal name. Jake and I have the same initials because Jake is really me. But I decided I didn't want to write a memoir, and I decided I wanted a little bit of distance from myself. So I named him Jake. And I love telling people that the reason I named him Jake is because when I was a child, I loved playing school. And I only had imaginary students because I was much too controlling for all of the kids in the neighborhood because this was school. This was not pretend school. This was real school. And my favorite imaginary student was Jake because I really wished my name were Jake. So back to my book talk, which I'm not doing a very good job at because there's so many things going through my head. And you're smiling so brightly. So thank you for making me feel comfortable. And so in Act One, where I left off, Jake volunteers every day at a nursing home. And I did that every day in middle school. And there's a lady who he reads to named Miss Burns who can tell Jake is not okay. And Jake, the lady, Miss Burns, calls Jake's mom. And that really happened in my own life, where there was a lady who I'd read to every day, and she could just sense that something was not wrong, was not right with me. And she ended up calling my mom. And it's because of that Jake, because of that, I end up in a mental health facility. And in Act Two, in the beginning of Act Two, Jake does not want to participate in treatment. He thinks they've all made a horrible mistake, and he's filled with rage. But we know, and I know, that Jake really needs to be there. And Jake realizes he needs to be there. And you end up spending a year with Jake at Whispering Pines, and he succeeds and then he fails, and he succeeds and then he fails. And writing the failures was so hard because I'd have to say to Jake, I'm sorry. I have to hurt you just one more time. But I promise it's going to be okay. And I knew it was okay. It was going to be okay because I am Jake. And so it's my true story that's fictionalized, though, of dealing with anorexia nervosa, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, and anxiety.
Yeah.
So Yeah, sorry that I weaved lots of different things in there.
Oh no, that's exactly what I hoped for. That's what I love, is getting all the weaving that you can't or might not get from the book itself.
Yeah. Well, something so interesting that I said is like you have such an interesting, wonderful presence. And I find that I want to share more when somebody makes me feel comfortable like you are right now. And I realize the more I talk about this book that I can become really, really vulnerable when I talk about it, but I don't have to. Like I can just give more surface level. But if I feel comfortable, if I feel warm and safe and loved, then I can go a bit deeper.
Oh,
And I surprise myself sometimes. I'm like, oh, I didn't think I'd ever share that with anyone.
right. Oh, well,
Yeah.
that is a huge compliment for me. So it's my turn to say thank you. That makes me
No,
feel
thank you.
wonderful. And I think probably also you might be feeling a little bit of what I'm sending to you over the Zoom screen, because this was a book I needed but didn't have. So
Oh,
my daughter is in the early stages of recovery from
oh,
anorexia. We are doing well.
oh, good.
She gave me permission to say this to you because, of course, I ran to her with your book. Uh,
Oh,
and it was a long 2 years, a very difficult 2 years, and I devoured every book I could get my hands on in order to figure out, as a mom,
mm,
what's going on, what's going through her head, how do I help, what do I do, what do I not do. I read every nonfiction book I could get my hands on. I read every memoir. I read
mm,
novel. I read everything I could find. And when I read your book, which is this beautiful book in verse as well,
mm.
which just adds to the whole experience, I just thought, this is the book. This
Oh,
book,
thank you.
John, was the book that made me feel like I understood her more than I ever could,
Oh,
because I was able to hear your story. I
oh,
can't say
thank you.
enough, from a book lover and an educator, how much I love this book, but from a mom who was desperate to help
Yeah.
her child, this book, this
Well,
book was
that means everything. That means because I too at one time read every book about eating disorders, and so many of them were really harmful to me, and so many of them acted as how-to manuals. And there are very few books about anorexia nervosa, about disordered eating, that I actually recommend. And so for you to say that means so much to me, and it means that I really did do the job that I sought to do, which was to really take care of the reader and to take care of the moms and dads and family members who are reading the book, because like you said, you went through it with your daughter, and your daughter went through it, and what it's like to get to the other side. And I think so many of the books aren't really hopeful. And so something that was always on my mind when I read the book, and I was thinking about when you were talking, that means that I was successful, is something that I actually write in The Gift of Story, which is that books can be the perfect prescriptions to let us know we're going to be okay. And when I was writing the book, that was always on a post-it note in front of me. And it wasn't the same post-it note. I would write it every single time, because there's something about actually writing it, right? That like imbues it then into your heart, because that was always my guiding light, is that I didn't want to create a book that your child would get from the library and it would teach them how to have an eating disorder. There's nothing in this book. I hope I was really careful. There's nothing in this book, I think, that would inspire someone to want to have an eating disorder, which is what so many of the books sadly do. And I don't think the author like intentionally said, I'm going to write a book that's going to make people sick. But there are so many that do. And so my hope is that this is a book that will help someone heal, somebody who's going through it or somebody who has gone through it, and that hopefully it won't be triggering to them.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree. A lot of the books I read, I feel like, had a negative spin or didn't show the recovery process. They showed how you got to the worst part, but not
Yeah,
necessarily the possibilities that come. And I love hearing how you explain it in Acts, because it is this up and down kind
yeah,
of journey. And I love that Jake shared it all. It wasn't, just the fast forward of the difficult parts, but it was also, how do my relationships with family have to change? How
Mm,
does my relationship with other kids have to change? What about new schools? It just had so many elements that, even if you were a reader who didn't have a connection to an eating disorder,
mm,
we all have connections to being human and to having something
yeah,
feel really hard
yeah.
and to get over it. And of course, because writing and notebooks
Mhm.
and that was part of it too,
Musicals.
I could identify,
Yeah.
the music I could identify even more.
No,
But
that means so much. And that's something that surprised me right away in the beginning as people, excuse me, started to share feedback, is that there was always something about the voice that they identified with.
yeah,
And I've had so many conversations with people about that inner voice that I didn't realize so many people have, that it doesn't manifest always as anorexia nervosa, but that negative voice in our head that we have to figure out how to quiet, you know.
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's two other things I want to say, because you mentioned being really careful to take care of the reader, which you
Yeah.
definitely did. Starting with, the letter to the reader from Kate DeCamillo.
Oh, it's so beautiful. I love it
Correct.
so.
Yeah.
Actually, I use that often to book talk the book because it's the perfect way to introduce it. And I don't, usually it's toward the end of a presentation during which I've talked about her a lot. And I don't start reading it by saying, this is a foreword by KHD Camillo. I read it and then I say, your friend, KHD Camillo. And then they all clap.
Yes. Like, oh, but it's beautiful, such a beautiful way to open about,
Yeah.
you know, going through hard things, and we all have a story, and you can tell it. And that may be what someone else needs. But then you bookend it so beautifully by taking care of us at the end of the book
Yeah.
too, with a letter from you to dear reader. So I definitely felt cared for the whole time. And I
Oh,
felt
thank
in that last part of just take care of you, find what brings you joy. It just beautiful message from the first page to the
Oh,
last.
thank you. Yeah, and I didn't know in the beginning if that would actually make the final book, the my letter to the reader. I really wrote that for myself. I wrote it to give myself permission to say, for now, this is the draft. This is the best the draft can be before we submitted it to editors. And I remember writing most of it on an airplane and just sobbing. And I had to turn to the person next to me and saying, "I'm okay. I'm just really overwhelmed right now in a good way, in a happy way. It means that I'm now done with this draft. And I'm grateful that we ended up putting it in the book. The same with KHD Camillo's forward. Originally, that was only for the advanced reader copy, and then the decision was made to include it. And I'm so grateful that both of those are in there. And recently, I recorded my author's note for the audiobook. And I was like, oh, this is going to be easy. Like I read it aloud so many times. Like it's such a part of me, the cadence of the language. And then I got in the booth and I kept choking up and I kept crying. And I was like, why am I so emotional? I've read this so many times. And through talking to the producer, I really realized that it made it feel like real, like that it was real, like this book was real. And to actually be able to record it was really overwhelming. And I listened to the audiobook 2 weeks ago and I sobbed the entire time listening to the audiobook. And then when I listened to my author's note, which I didn't think I would, I'm grateful that they kept a clip where you can hear me choking up reading it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's that emotion, that connection that you can
Yeah.
feel. You can feel it on every page. And I'm curious because, I've read your picture books and I've read your adult nonfiction. Why verse? Why not
Yeah.
typical narrative? Which I'm really glad you did. I love
Yeah.
it. So I'm
Oh,
just
me too.
curious decision behind it.
Yeah, well, I have a hard time calling myself a poet, but all of my picture books actually are poetry. This is a school, I think, is a seven stanza poem, and this is a story is a six stanza poem. And I remember when Jennifer Lagarde, who's a school librarian and teaches at Rutgers, put my poem back together in This Is a School. And she got almost every line break right. And I was like, yes, she sees it. It's a poem. And when I call it a poem to kids, they're like, that's not a poem. Like, well, let me show you. It actually is. It's an ode. And so when it came time to write Louder Than Hunger, which I started writing the day after I finished revising The Gift of Story, it was the very next day, because I knew when I wrote the story as clarifier chapter in The Gift of Story that it was time for me to actually write my true story. And at the time, I thought maybe it would be memoir. So anyway, it was the day after I finished revising The Gift of Story. This big weight had been lifted off of my shoulders because I turned the book in 2 years late. And I heard Jake's voice, and I opened up my notebook, and it just started coming out as poetry. And for a long time, the book actually started in Act Two. The book started when Jake was hospitalized, and Ruth had just handed him the notebook. And it took a while, I want to say 2 drafts, before I went back to what you now know as the opening, which is Jake writing his name over and over and over again. And none of those poems in the first 86 pages or 90 pages existed until I want to say the second draft. And so, yeah, I knew it had to be told in verse. And I think a lot of it is the cadence of my voice, and which is Jake's voice, just goes really nicely in verse.
Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
also think, as a reader of someone who reads verse, I feel like there is, obviously it's very lyrical because it is in verse, but because it is just the bare bones of emotion on the page, for me, I feel like I'm able to feel even
Mm.
more in a verse novel, which may not be true because I still feel in other
No,
books, but
yeah, I
there's
agree
just
with you.
something.
Especially hard topics. I think hard topics are easier to digest in verse. And something that I'm so grateful readers are realizing is that Jake loves playing with the page. I love playing with the page.
Yeah.
And Jake doesn't want to take up any space in his real life. He would rather be invisible. He likes to just blend in. He doesn't want any attention. He doesn't like, he couldn't stand on a stage, even though he dreams about being on a stage one day, but he can take up space on the page. And I loved writing the poems where it was like just 3 words that would like take up the entire page, because it was where Jake felt comfortable. And I also love, what I love about verse is sometimes like it's a a 1 stanza poem, sometimes it's a 6-page poem. And so I just thought that that was really fun as a writer and really helped me develop Jake's voice.
Yeah. I also loved the letters and the pieces of
Oh,
the
me
books
too.
that were in there as well. That was, as someone who loves letter writing, who loves the journal, I appreciated that. And I think it brought some of the relationships that Jake had in the book
Yeah.
to life
Yeah,
as well.
letter writing always helps me. Sometimes when I was writing Louder Than Hunger, if I wasn't quite sure where to go with the poem, I would actually just write it as a letter, knowing it wasn't going to be a letter, and it would help me. There's something just really freeing to me, and I've never talked about this publicly, with just a dear and somebody's name and then a closing. Like, I love writing emails, even though I'm always behind on my email. I feel like the email always has a structure where I'm comfortable, and I find that I can open up my heart more easily through letter writing.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
like the same thing. I think for me, it's being able to write with somewhat of intended audience in mind helps it
yeah,
flow a bit more. And I'm one of those journalers who I don't even want to count how many pages in my notebook of, letters that I will never ever send, but certainly
yeah, to write them.
sticking it out
Yeah.
to write them.
Yeah, like you can write it to the person and it's freeing in some way, or letter to yourself. Like a good friend of mine who works in publishing gave me really, really good advice. She said, John, I want you to write a letter to yourself that's only for you. You'll never share it with anyone else. And the day that Kirkus reviews Louder Than Hunger, you will open that letter and you will remind yourself that you did not, why you wrote the book. And the day the Kirkus review came, it was mostly good. It was one line that I perseverate about, and I read that letter to myself, and I was like, yes, it reminded me and it grounded me.
I love that. What a beautiful gift that anybody could give to themselves is just writing a letter themselves in the future.
Yeah. So do you always use the same type of notebook, the same brand of notebook?
Okay, well,
Sorry,
if
I'm
we're
interviewing
being
you now.
honest, I have 8 different notebooks that I write in. I just hoard them all, but I do have one that is always typically the same. That's kind of the put it away. Nobody sees that notebook. It's spiral bound. It's got light lines. It's got a certain mechanical pencil, of course, that I
Oh,
have
I
to
love.
write in it.
Are you very particular about what you write with?
I am.
I
I
am as well.
I am. And I'm not what's the word? I'm not fancy. It's literally my favorite thing to write with in the notebook is a mechanical pencil because of the gliding
Mm,
and how easy
uh,
I can just keep writing, if
yeah,
a little bit more. I do love a good gel pen that glides across the page, but I'm not picky. As long as it
yeah.
feels good, I feel like I can get the words out.
Yeah, it's the gliding. Yeah, I am really particular about what I use. And one of my favorite things during school visits and professional development is I give away the same brand of notebook that I use. And I always share that my notebook can only be purchased at Target. And I talk a lot about Target, my favorite store.
Me
And I
too.
always say my favorite notebook costs $4.83, and it's worth every single penny. And at the end of every school visit presentation, I call one child up who I give the notebook to. And I almost know immediately when that child enters the room that they need that notebook. And I realized after writing Louder Than Hunger that I look for the little Jakes of the world and I look for the little Johnny Shoes of the world, and I find ways to honor them. And I think one of the best gifts that I can give them is that notebook, hoping that they write like what's going on in their lives in the notebook. And I know that that would have made a big difference in my life if my fourth grade teacher had gone to Target and bought me a $4.83 notebook and a really good pen. And I also give away a pen with the notebook, and I hand the child my pouch that's filled with like really sometimes expensive pens and markers. And I say, I want you to go sit over there and I want you to go through this pouch. And I don't want you to close your eyes, because they often will close their eyes and just reach. And I say, I want you to take them all out and find the one that feels right to you. And then I use that pen or that marker to write them a poem in their notebook. And I tell them that the hardest thing about a new notebook is starting in it. And I say to them, I've done one of the hardest things. A page has already been filled. And then on my notebook, there's a little flap that opens up that a lot of people would tear off. And I always write the date on that flap, and I say, this is the date we started this notebook. And then I always write them a little message. Usually I write whatever their name is, comma, please take care of your heart. So yeah, it's my favorite. I love talking about notebooks. So sorry if I went too deep with that, but
No, no. It's funny because I have a second podcast called Get Literate, and it's all about books and reading and writing and notebooks. And we spend so much time talking about our favorite notebooks. So that was right up my alley. And what a gift. What a
yeah, it's the
beautiful
best gift.
practice to have when you meet students. Oh,
Yeah, I
well,
love it.
I also know that you've done this kind of beautiful gift giving to adults and teachers too. I have a friend who is a librarian that met you. She actually was the person who gifted me the gift
Oh, the gift
of
story.
story because she had met you and talked to you and shared some personal things with you, and you ended up gifting her a book the next time you saw her,
Oh,
which changed things for her, and now she pays all of that forward.
yeah.
So the
Oh,
ripple
that means so
that you
much.
have.
Yeah, yeah. My rule always in every presentation, and it gets very expensive, is for every time I talk about a book, I must give it away if the book is already out. And I work really hard to find like the perfect person for that. And time after time after time, the principal or the librarian or the reading specialist will say, how did you know? Like, how did you know that child needed that? How did you know that child is going through a really hard time? And before writing The Gift of Story, I wouldn't always tell the truth because it sounded like so woo woo. Where it is, I can just see into them and I can see the pain. And is what I thankfully can now say to people is once you read Louder Than Hunger, you'll better understand me and you'll better understand why that's so important for me. because I know how much it can change somebody's life. For me, it really was musical theater that saved me.
Yeah. Yeah, I enjoyed reading about all of that in the book. Don't have a musical bone in my body, although I enjoy singing in the shower and in the car. So I love that. I feel like it's so connected. The music and reading and
Mm.
writing and creating and all of that just comes together to have this effect and this emotion on us that we
Yeah.
can take.
And the word that you just used, connect, or you said connection, I think that's the theme of all my books. Like, this is a school is about connection. This is a story is about connection. This is the gift of story. I always mess up the gift of story, and this is the story. And once my agent said, "Are you sure you want to have two books that are so close in title?" And I said, "I'll never mess it up. I mess it up all the time." And then, of course, louder than hunger. But yeah, because I think that's what we're always doing, and I think that's why I read, is to connect.
Yes, that's the beauty of books, right? The gifts inside of them to see ourselves, to see other
Yeah.
people, and then connect around those things. Like us today talking about your book, you've given the world, a gift of a book, but you've given me something as a mom that I hadn't been able to
Yeah.
find until that book. And
Well, thank you.
it's so powerful. It's so powerful.
Well,
It's
I'm
beautiful.
grateful, and I'm grateful your daughter's doing better. Please tell her I said hello.
I will. I will. Thank you for that. Well, it has been a pleasure. I'm so glad to say now, I know John Schu, right? It
No,
is
we're
me
friends. You're
talking to you
friends. Yeah.
on social media. Yeah, we're buddies now. So I'm just so glad to see this book kind of launch into the world. I'm grateful to be a part of it with this podcast, and just know you've got a huge fan in upstate New York that
Well,
follows
thank
your
you.
work and tries the best she can to give books as much love as you do.
No, you do. You're a beautiful book advocate and cheerleader. And thank you for, again, you just have the best like aura around you. So thank you for your positive. The listeners can't see that, but they can hear it and feel it. So
Oh,
thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you so much. And I will put links to the books and to your website and social media in the show notes so that everybody can find you too.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for listening, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, from me for listening. And I'll see you inside the next episode of the Kid Lit Love podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Kid Lit Love podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes at alitlife.com. And if you want more, you might like to listen to my other podcast called Get Literate. It's a podcast that explores all things books and reading, notebooks and writing, and everything in between to build a life you love. One more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a bookish friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish community of kid lit love. Thanks for listening.